Hey, welcome to our YouTube channel, Ancient to Modern. If you wonder why that name, it's because we're taking an ancient text, in our case the New Testament, trying to bring it to life in the modern world. We want to do other topics beside that, and as weeks go on, we'll talk about theology, we'll talk about how theological issues impact our world today. So if you have any questions, any comments, any criticisms, put them in the comments section below. We'll be sure to address those just as quick as we can. 2 episodes ago, we started going through the New Testament with looking at the Gospel of Mark. We start with Mark because it was the first gospel written. So today we'll go to the Gospel of Matthew, which I know is the first one in your New Testament, but chronologically it came after Mark. We don't really know who wrote Matthew. A church tradition said it was Matthew the tax collector. We're not too certain about that. In fact, we're probably pretty certain that it wasn't. But we don't know exactly who wrote Matthew. We do know that it was written 20 years after Mark was. And we also know that whoever wrote Matthew literally had a copy of Mark in front of them and was copying down a lot of Mark into Matthew. In fact, Matthew uses 90% of the Gospel of Mark. And often when the writer of Matthew does use Mark, he uses it almost word for word. So a lot of the stories we find in Mark, we also find in Matthew. Now we know a couple other things about Matthew. It seems that Matthew was written toward early Jewish Christian believers because Matthew has a special affinity toward those issues that Jewish Christians would have understood and been concerned with. That's why right off the bat we have this very long and extensive genealogy section of Matthew. If you read that first chapter, it just, in the old King James Version, it was so-and-so begat so-and-so begat so-and-so. And there is 42 generations listed in this genealogy section. It goes from Abraham to King David. That's 14 generations. Then the next 14 go from King David to the exile when Israel was taken off into Babylon in 586 BC. And then it has 14 more generations from the exile to Joseph. Now, right away, we should know that this is not a literal or exhaustive accounting of every generation. The math doesn't add up. We're covering thousands of years here. But rather, this is maybe a theological retelling. How do we get from Abraham? Be sure we hit King David. Be sure we get to the exile before we get to Jesus. So we have 3 groups of 14. Now, there's another way to read this. That's also 6 groups of 7. 7, 7, 7, 7, 7, 7, which makes Jesus the 7th 7. There's theology going on there, the perfect number. We don't understand that. We kind of missed that point, but trust me, early Jewish believers would have found that right away. The other way we think we know was written to Jewish believers is Matthew describes things a little differently. For instance, in both the Gospel of Luke and the Gospel of Matthew, we have this extended sermon of Jesus or extended teaching of Jesus recounted. In Luke, they call it the Sermon on the Plain. But in Matthew, it's the Sermon on the Mount. We should look at it very similarly to what happened with the giving of the 10 Commandments. Moses goes up to the top of the mountain, comes down with these very words of God that give the Jewish people life. Now we have here Jesus on top of the mountain giving these words of life to his new people. And so we call it the Sermon on the Mount. Some other things about Matthew that we should know. First off, Matthew takes it easy on the disciples. We said 2 episodes ago that in Mark's kind of rough on the disciples. They never understand. They never get what Jesus is saying. But that's not the case in Matthew. In Matthew, they understand. The disciples are helpful, and they get it. Let me tell you one story about how this is illustrated. It's when Jesus walks on the water. The disciples are out in the Sea of Galilee, and a storm comes up, and the wind's against them, and the waves are battering the boat, and they're desperately trying to make it back to land. and they're straining and they're fearing for their life. And Jesus looks at them and decides he wants to go out to them. In both Mark and Matthew, Jesus walks out to the boat. In both Mark and Matthew, the disciples see Jesus and are terrified. This would have been a little out of the ordinary, not only in their world, but in ours. And they think it's a ghost. Jesus eventually climbs in the boat with them. And as soon as he gets in the boat, the wind and the waves stop. And they're amazed at what has just happened. Except in Mark, we read this. And they did not understand. But that's not what we have in Matthew. In Matthew, that's the very first time the disciples recognize Jesus as the Son of God. When they get to shore, the disciples say, "Truly you are the Son of God." That's the difference between Mark 6 and Matthew 14. Let's talk about the things that Matthew says over and over and over again. Well, there's one in particular. Matthew is the gospel that tells us our insides must change. Matthew's also the one that's always contrasting what should happen with the Pharisees. Now, the Pharisees get a bad reputation, largely because of the Gospel of Matthew. The Gospel of Matthew is really the only one that really heightens the Pharisees as the enemy. But we would expect that in a book written to Jewish Christians. They know all the different groups. So in Matthew, Jesus says, your righteousness, your goodness should surpass those of the Pharisees. And in the first century, the people would have looked at the Pharisees as the paragon of good people. So Jesus says a couple things. He says your insides should lead the change in your life. In Matthew we read, it is out of the overflow of the heart that the mouth speaks. It's telling us that regardless of what facade we put on our outside, the inside always finds its way to the surface. So therefore, if God's going to really make a difference in our life, it's got to start inside and make its way out. It's not enough for me to just manage my desire to punch everybody I see or to yell at everybody I see because they drive me nuts. My inside has to change. It's not good enough if I go on hating everybody but just put a fake smile on my face. The other thing that Matthew says that most people find difficult. In Matthew we read the following verse, be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. Now, that's a little hard for most of us to accept. Be perfect. Now, we try to do that a lot of different ways. We try to be sure we look nice. We try to be sure our clothes match. We try to be sure our house looks good. And in fact, if our life goes a little wrong, sometimes we try to hide it behind another facade. We need to be sure that everything we present is the best or perfect, and that animates a lot of what a lot of people do. That's not what Matthew's about. The word perfect here is not flawless, as we think that word perfect means. The word perfect means whole or complete. You need to be whole, complete, mature, even as your heavenly Father is mature. Now, it's baseball season. The last week we have baseball. Our local Cubs are off to a terrible start. In my basement, I have a glove. It's a glove I've had for 20 years. It's a Rawlings. It's all its way through Kids Little League and I coached the travel team. And it is the perfect baseball glove. Even though it's hard for me to throw anymore, I'm getting old, every spring I get out the glove and I still oil it up. And it's perfect because it's broken in. Most of you know what I'm talking about. When a glove is perfectly broken in, you don't even have to make a physical move to catch the ball. The glove just naturally fits around the ball when it lands in the pocket of your glove. Now, if you took my glove, there's going to be scrapes on it, and there's going to be scratches, and you can see infield dirt and places where it's been kind of rubbed, kind of bare because my hand's been in and out of it so many times. It's not perfect in the fact that it's flawless, but it is perfect that it just does exactly what it's supposed to do. It fits its intended use perfectly. That's what Matthew's all about. When your inside leads the way. Your insides change to make its way to the outside. So that's what Matthew is all about. It is one of the longer Gospels, and it is one I encourage you to become familiar with. If you have a question about it, leave in the comments. Hey, subscribe to the channel, like us, but most importantly, leave a comment. We want you to drive this. We want to answer your questions, and we look forward to hearing from you. Just want you to have a good week and look forward to seeing you again next week.